and then we're going to be hearing from Oko, who will be presenting, and then unfortunately she can't stay around for our Q&A, so we're going to be hearing from Dr. Carla Edworthy, who's going to be answering any questions that we might have for today. So just a note that you have been muted and your webcams have been disabled as part of the standard Zoom webinar feature, but we really want to hear from you today and we want to hear all your input and your questions. So you're welcome to use either the chat box or the Q&A box to converse with us today. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to send those through as the presentation is happening, and then we'll get to those at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to send them through any time so you don't forget. Then our recordings will be made available on our YouTube sites. So if you go to YouTube and just type in Sustainable Seas Trust, it'll pop up there. And if you have any questions or comments after today's session, you're welcome to email us at webinars@sscafrica.org.za, and we will pass those along to the speaker. For now, we're going to move over to our presentation for today. So it's going to be very exciting, and we're going to be hearing about fish nurseries and why those are important and what they are and why they matter. So it's going to be very exciting. All right.
Hello, everybody. My name is Oko Sotshongaye. I'm a SASTA volunteer. I'm based at SAEON, Elwanda node in Gqeberha. So today I'll be sharing with you my passion for understanding the early life stages of fish and their distribution on the coastal nearshore environment, as well as the estuarine environment. Hey guys, firstly, I'm going to explain to you what a larvae is. Okay, so fish, male fish and female fish mate, and they produce eggs. So when the eggs hatch, they hatch into larvae. So larvae are basically fish babies, which are mostly found in nursery areas. So nursery areas are areas where you find lots of fish babies.
Why do people need fish nurseries?
Okay, so fish nurseries are very important for fish because they provide food for them. They provide also shelter so that they can shield their young ones, and they can't really do that in the offshore environment. So it's very, very important for fish when they want to make babies that they come to nursery areas, which are more protective for their young ones.
Okay, so not the big open ocean.
Yes, so some of the fish, because of you find them offshore, like in the deep waters, they lay their eggs there, and some of their eggs do not hatch because of the conditions that are offshore. But some of them do hatch, and when they hatch, they make their way back to the nursery areas where there are more and lots of food. Okay, so that's basically showing you what happens to the fish that get spawned offshore. So they come back to the coastal environments to settle at a later stage in their development.
Okay, so are the larvae left in the shallow coastal ecosystems in the fish nurseries? Are the larvae left there and they hatch, or how does it work?
So when they hatch offshore, they basically get drifted by the currents. Sometimes they make their way back onto the ocean, onto the nearshore environment, and sometimes they get drifted further and further offshore, and they grow there. So, like I said, that they have these different stages that they have. So when they want to make babies, they make their way to the shallow nearshore environment.
Okay, but so they hatch out in the open ocean, and then when they hatch, they must quickly swim inland to shallower ecosystems. It's a tough start. Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so why do we study larvae? Because when we understand where larvae are found, then we are able to know where the adults are found as well. So the adult fish are basically the ones that we eat. So in order to get more and more fish, we need to make sure that the adults are protected. There are many ways that we can make sure that we do not run out of fish in the ocean, and this includes the use of nets that do not catch other animals. So if we use like big nets, like the one you see there at the top left corner, then those nets catch even birds, turtles, and sometimes seals as well, and whales. So it is very, very important that fishing industry use at least nets that are not catching other species of fish that we do not need as people, like that we do not feed on. So when they go fishing, they're looking mostly for fish that we eat. So it's important to use the fishing gear or the nets that only capture the fish that we need. And when people often make competitions on fish, and they take fish, sometimes they take fish that is endangered. So if they take too much of fish that is endangered, that fish is at risk of being extinct, then we might not see that fish again if they take like too much of it in the ocean to an extent that we run out of those species. Okay, so in order to make sure that we do not run out of fish, marine protected areas were introduced in our waters. So some of the habitats in the ocean, there are areas in the ocean that fishing is not allowed. This is done in order to make sure that we do not run out of fish. Because in these areas, fish become bigger, larger, and scientists believe that larger fish are more fertile than younger fish. Whereas in comparison to areas that are not protected, where fishing happens mostly, fish do not get bigger, as they do not get bigger as the fish that you find in marine protected areas. So they do not reproduce much. So which means that those areas, the unprotected areas, are most likely to experience what we call overfishing. And remember, we need fish for protein. And there are so many families that live along the coast that depend on this fish as a source of income, on fishing as a source of income. So if there's no fish, then other people are gonna go hungry because they do not have jobs.
So what are the major problems that the nursery habitats that we talk? Farming is the first one. Farmers use what we call pesticides and fertilizers, and these are very dangerous. I know that farming happens on land, but when it rains, there's something called runoff that happens, and then the water ends up in the rivers, and whatever goes into the rivers will definitely end up in the ocean. And also we get waste that gets discharged onto our oceans, as well as plastic pollution. What do I mean by plastic pollution? So this is mostly the plastics that we use for packaging. Can be bottles, plastic bags that we throw away and litter. And these end up in our oceans. These are very, very dangerous for our fish. Okay, so what happens when the fertilizers and the pesticides get into our water? What happens is that they cause what we call algal blooms. Okay, you can see the picture over there showing algal bloom in that ocean. That green stuff that you see over there, that's algal bloom. So when there's algal bloom in the ocean, it means that there is no oxygen. So if there's no oxygen in the water, nothing will live there. So all the fish will die. You can see in the picture at the top there, the fish have died because of algal bloom in the water. Okay, so fish larvae, the fish babies, they eat mostly what we call phytoplankton in the water. Those are very thin, tiny plants that you find in the water. So larvae mostly mistake those the plastics with food, of which they do not feed on plastic, they feed on phytoplankton. So what happens is that when we throw plastic bags in the ocean, they do not biodegrade, so they get broken down into smaller pieces of plastics called microplastics. So those smaller pieces, they get consumed by larvae. As you can see in that picture over there, those are small bits of plastics that you find in the ocean, and they get eaten by larvae. So whatever animal that feeds on larvae, then it is also going to have plastic as well on its body.
Okay, we use larvae are generally very little in terms of size. They're very small and microscopic. So we use a stereo microscope to identify them. So when we back from the field, we've collected the samples. We then put them in a petri dish, the one that you see in that picture over there and then identify using a microscope. So we basically count how many fish are there, we measure them, and we also identify them. On which family do they belong to, what are their common names, etc., etc. So larvae are completely different from their adults. They are poorly developed, and what you see there is larvae at preflection stage. They don't have scales, they have no pigment in their bodies like adults, and they have no fins. They only start having fins at post-flexion stage. So here we have a picture of larvae at the top. So I want you guys to guess which adult that larva is coming from. Remember, when we identify fish, we look at different characteristics, diagnostic characteristics, and these include the spots around their bodies, or sometimes the lines on their bodies. We also look at the shape of their mouth, the shape of their eyes, and also the location of the fins, if it has fins. But that one over there doesn't have fins, so we can't use fins to identify which fish it's coming from. See, so that fish there is called a sole. The first one is a blacktail. The second one, it's a zebrafish. And the third one there is a sole. So that larvae that you see over there belongs to the sole, and you can clearly see the spots in the bodies of the sole. And it's definitely not a blacktail, the first one, because it doesn't have stripes on its body. And it's definitely not a zebra tail as well. So the next, here we have another larvae. I want you to look at the shape of the body. I think the important feature or characteristic here is the shape of the body. When you're looking at the shape of the body of that larvae, which adult do you think that larvae is going to grow into? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. Okay, it is definitely the first one. It's called a blenny fish. It does not look exactly the same as an adult in terms of the dots or the colorings in the body, but when you're looking at the tail of that fish, it definitely looks like an adult, and the other two fish are completely different from that one. So it's very, very important to identify fish using those characteristics like body shape and the spots in their bodies. Okay, the next one. Okay, so before I leave you, I'm gonna leave you with this activity here. I want you to match the larvae with the respective adults. So like I've said, you must look at the body shape, at the lines or spots of its body in order to identify them. You can also look at the fin type and the fin location, where the fins are located. Okay, so what you're gonna do is you're gonna match them, the larvae with the adults, and then tell us why do you think it's that particular result that you have chosen. Okay, thank you. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you so much to Oko for that presentation. I'm just going to share the results of the last slide that we had there. And then if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to send those through in the chat, and then we're gonna we're gonna raise those now with Carla. For those who did guess, the answers there was that the first one is an anchovy, and then B was a sunfish, and then C was the Cape stumpnose. Yeah, so a very big thank you to Oko for the presentation, for putting all of that together. We're really glad to have had her here today. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to stay around for the Q&A, but we're now going to move on to some questions. And just before we get to those, we do have some online activities available for this week, specifically for Marine Week, based on the webinars. So if you're interested, you can go take a look at africanwasteacademy.org, and there will be a course there called Marine Week 2021. And when it asks you for a code, you'll just have to type in MW21. You may need to use a teacher or your parents' help just to use an email address just to register. But we hope to to see you there. For now, let's get going with some questions for Carla. Dr. Edworthy. I see you are on mute, but we're really, really glad that you can be with us today and to answer any questions that people have about fish nurseries. For the first one, can you tell us why are fish nurseries important to people?
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'd love to tell you why they're important to people. And I think the most obvious answer is that in order to have big fish that we can eat and catch, we need the baby fish to survive. So ultimately, the nursery habitats are making sure that the young fish are surviving to become adults so that they can go to the adult populations and then be caught in the fisheries that provide food for people. So that is probably the most important function of fish nurseries. You know, small fish are always getting eaten by bigger fish. In the open where they don't have any protection, they will easily get eaten by bigger fish and then they won't obviously survive that. Also, nursery habitats provide the food that little fish need to grow big and strong and become big fish. So they are definitely important for people, and that's why it's so important that we protect them.
Thanks, Carla. It's great just to bring it home and that, you know, if we didn't have the fish nurseries, then we wouldn't have any fish. I see there's a question here in the Q&A box that says, how important are temporary open closed estuaries as nursery habitats, and what happens when the estuaries are closed? Would you mind maybe also just explaining to everyone what an open and closed estuary is as well, Carla?
Sure. So basically, an open estuary is an estuary that is permanently open to the ocean. So basically, it receives fresh water coming from the river side, but it also receives seawater coming from the ocean side. And that causes the water to mix and become this estuary environment as we know it, which is basically a moderate salinity, which means the amount of salt in the water. So an open estuary would have access to the ocean and to the river at all times. And then a temporarily open or closed estuary are estuaries that change their state from being open to the ocean. And then if there's sand buildup, it closes the estuary to the ocean. And then there's only inflow from a river, for example. That is if there is water coming from the riverside, from if it's raining a lot and things like that. So a closed estuary is an important nursery habitat for many fishes, especially those that can survive conditions that generally occur there. So what does happen when an estuary closes is that because there's not always so much water flowing in from the riverside, the evaporation causes the salinity to become quite high. But there are species that can survive this. So for example, in the last slide where we saw the Cape stumpnose, which is one of the larvae you had to select and match to the adult, that species, it easily survives in high salinity conditions in a closed estuary. So a closed estuary is still a really good nursery habitat for fishes like that. But then again, there are conditions in estuaries that make it difficult for plants like seagrasses that the fish eat to survive. So the changes in an estuary state can affect the nursery function, but there are species that can still survive there. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Carla. I think we can move on to the next question for now, which is how do algal blooms kill fish? I know Oko mentioned it in her presentation, but can you maybe just sort of explain to us and the kids hopefully joining us just sort of what that means and yeah.
So a harmful algal bloom is called harmful because it does tend to make the conditions in the water uninhabitable, which means difficult to live in for a lot of animals. And the reason for this is because the density and the number of algae that grow in a small space is so high that they use up all the oxygen in the water. So in biology, you will learn that plants generally, with photosynthesis, they produce oxygen and use carbon dioxide. But the problem with a bloom event is the density is so high that when the photosynthesis is not happening, and the plant cells start to use oxygen, and they start to die and degrade, then the conditions become so difficult for animals to live in because there's absolutely no oxygen in the water. So the little fish and even other plants or other sea creatures really can't survive there because there's just no oxygen in the water. And that is because those plant blooms are just so dense in a small area. And you'll often see associated with a harmful algal bloom, there'll just be lots of dead fish and crabs and other animals lying on the beach. And it's a very sad thing to see.
Thanks, Carla. There's another question in the Q&A here that says, if we see an estuary that has been cut off from the ocean, should we dig the sand out to open it up?
So this is a difficult one. I think there are estuaries that open and close naturally. If something occurs naturally in the environment, it is usually best that people do not interfere with that process. So, of course, it becomes really complex later on because the reason perhaps for an estuary closing may be as a result of a drought, which is a result of climate change, which is actually the fault of people. But at the same time, if you interfere with the system, it can cause other problems that you may not expect. So apart from the fact that it will probably be really difficult to dig a hole big enough to open the estuary to the river, especially if the conditions persist that closed the estuary in the first place, it may not be worth your time, but it also probably is not a good idea as opposed to just letting things happen naturally.
Thanks, Carla. So most natural environments that we come across, we shouldn't interfere unless it's a turtle who's washed up on the beach or or an injured penguin. We should rather not get involved.
Yes, it's always a very difficult decision to make, and I think every circumstance has a different situation, and you need to kind of judge it at the time. But generally, if it appears that it's a natural phenomenon, it's best not to interfere.
Okay, that's good, really good to know. And then can you tell us, how long do fish stay as a larvae?
Well, that would differ a lot between different species. So some fish larvae grow really fast and other fish larvae grow really slow. So for example, I would say the stump nose that we spoke about earlier, that species has quite a relatively short larval phase, and it would probably take them around a month to not be classified as larvae anymore. So there's a lot of different phases that a larvae goes through, and generally the larval stages, which is different stages of the larval development, are associated with different things. So for example, once the larvae has grown its fins completely, it's become colored and starts to look like its adult form, you would no longer classify it as a larvae. Larvae are generally those small little fish that can't really swim. They don't really have well-developed fins. So some species actually go through that phase extremely quickly, whereas others would take quite a bit longer. So it really does depend on the species.
Is it generally linked to the size, so that if a fish is going to only grow to be a small fish, then they are only a larvae for a very short period of time and then they reach that size? Or does it depend how much growing they have to do?
It would seem that way, but I don't think it is necessarily like that. I don't think that the larval duration differs depending on the size of the fish, because like I said, once the fish is able to swim and it has all its fin elements, it's no longer considered a larvae, even though it's still significantly smaller than what it will be when it's a fully grown adult. So I'm not 100% sure about this answer, but I don't believe it is necessarily dependent on the adult size at the end, because some fish also take extremely long to grow to become really big adults, but their larval stages are still short.
Okay, that's very interesting. So still lots to be discovered.
Yes.
And then there's another question here that says, are larvae more resistant than the adult stages to survive adverse or difficult conditions?
Once again, very difficult to answer because it really depends on the species. So I really like this question because it's actually exactly what I study. And I kind of look at how the larvae are more sensitive or less sensitive to climate change, for example, when they are larvae compared to adults. And in some species, we have seen really high sensitivity in the larvae, but really significantly less sensitivity in the adult stages. But then again, there are species who are really tolerant in their larvae stages, and that's usually because they're living in really dynamic environments. So for example, in estuary, the conditions are really different to what they are in the open ocean, and they're less stable. So the conditions are changing all the time, and the larvae really do need to be tolerant of all these changes. But then when they are adults and they live in an open ocean where it's more stable, they're not necessarily as tolerant. So again, that is entirely species specific. And it's a very difficult thing to answer because every species is just so different.
Thanks, Carla. So definitely lots of different fish in the sea. We don't all react the same. Then we had another question come through that says, what happens to larvae if they eat plastic?
So this is something that we really still need to do a lot of work on to understand. I have had a personal experience where I've seen larvae that I've been working on eating plastic and having plastic in their gut. And it's really quite alarming to me because when I observed this in my actual work, I realized that some of the larvae were consuming plastic fibers, and it was getting so entangled in their gut that I couldn't imagine that this larvae would be able to eat normally. But in terms of an actual understanding of this, there's just so much that we still need to do to really know what the consequences are. But of course, it has been documented that some larvae, when they eat plastics, they just simply can't digest food and they die. There's other larvae which probably can consume plastics, but then there's accumulation of the plastics throughout the food chain because whatever eats the larvae is then eating plastic, which is in the larvae's stomach. So there are so many consequences, and we've just got so much work to do to understand exactly what the impacts are. And there's just so much plastic out there that this is a really urgent need for us to understand. But it certainly isn't good for the larvae, I would say.
Thanks, Carla. It's good to know that sort of some larvae can end up dying from eating sort of microplastics or plastics in general. And obviously we need them to grow up to be other fish so they can continue to be fish. I see that it's very nearly 2:45. So we're approaching the end of our session, which has gone very quickly. But if anyone has any questions at a later stage, you're welcome to email us. That's at webinars@sstafrica.org.za, and we can pass those along to either Carla or to Oko. Oko did also include a video that Sankop, not Sankop, that SAEON has put together that shows some of their research on that, but unfortunately we didn't have enough time to play it in today's session. So it's here in the chat box if anyone wants to go watch it after today. Yeah, so for now, I think we'll wrap up our session. Don't forget to go try out the activities on africanwasteacademy.org. And if you want to try out the activities and you're having any issues, you're welcome to contact us and we can try get that working for you. I see there's some comments here in the chat that says, thank you for the cool talk, Oko and Dr. Edworthy. So yeah, I'd just like to say a special thanks to Oko for putting together the presentation and for all the effort that she put in, and also to Carla, Dr. Carla here today for taking the time to come answer questions for us and tell us about her exciting research. Carla, I don't know if you want to share anything before we close today's session.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun chatting about fish nurseries, which I'm really passionate about.
Thanks, Carla, and thanks so much everyone for joining. Unfortunately, this is the last session in our Marine Week series, but we look forward to seeing you at our next series. So we're going to end it here for today, and we hope to see you all at our next series. And you're welcome to find the recording of today's session on YouTube. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. Enjoy your weekends.